What would you do if you discovered your grandfather didn't die the way your family told you? What if you found out he was murdered as part of a conspiracy so big it had been killing witnesses for 50 years? Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, would you risk everything to uncover the truth? Because that's exactly what one small-town sheriff did, and what he found changed everything. Sheriff Danny Morrison had been putting off cleaning out the old file room for 3 years. It was tedious work, the kind of thing you do after your regular shift, when the county building is quiet and you can actually think. The basement storage room smelled like dust and old paper, with boxes stacked floor to ceiling dating back to the 1940s. Most of it was routine stuff. Property disputes, minor arrests, budget reports that nobody would ever need again. But Danny was methodical by nature, the kind of cop who reads every page before deciding what to keep. And that's how he found the file marked Blackwater Mine Incident, 1962. The folder was thick, wedged between a stack of old traffic citations and a box of courthouse maintenance records. Danny had heard the story growing up. 17 miners killed in an explosion, the worst tragedy in Mattawan history. His own grandfather used to work the mines before switching to construction. Always said it was dangerous work, but good pay for a man with limited options. Danny pulled the file out and set it on the old wooden table he'd been using as a workspace. The incident report was yellowed with age, typed on an old typewriter with letters that had seen better days. According to the report, at approximately 11:47 in the morning on April the 23rd, 1962, a methane gas explosion had occurred in the eastern section of the mine. 17 miners were underground when it happened. All were presumed dead due to tunnel collapse and rescue teams being unable to reach the affected areas. Then came the list that made Danny's blood run cold. 17 names. 17 men who never made it home that day. 17 families destroyed in a single morning. But one name on that list made him stop reading entirely. Morrison, James Patrick, age 31, lead foreman, Morrison. His grandfather's name had been James Patrick Morrison. Danny felt something cold settle in his stomach. His grandfather had died when Danny was 12, but he'd always been told it was a heart attack. The family never talked about him working in the mines. Danny's father had always said his grandfather worked construction, built houses, stayed away from the dangerous underground work. But here was his grandfather's name, listed as the lead foreman of the crew that died in the Blackwater mine explosion. Danny flipped through the rest of the file, looking for more details. There were photographs, black and white images of the mine entrance, rescue equipment, officials in suits talking to reporters. But what caught his attention was a handwritten note clipped to the back of the incident report. Investigation incomplete. Recommend further inquiry into company safety protocols and timeline of events. Several discrepancies noted in witness statements. Deputy R. Collins. Below that, in different handwriting, case closed by order of Sheriff Hawkins. No further investigation required. Danny stared at the note. Someone had wanted to investigate further, but had been told to stop. Why would a sheriff shut down an investigation into 17 deaths? He kept reading. The next document was a settlement agreement between Cumberland Coal Company and the families of the victims. Each family received $5,000, a significant amount in 1962, but not enough to compensate for losing a husband and father. What was strange was how quickly everything had been settled. The explosion happened on April 23rd. By May 15th, less than 3 weeks later, all the families had signed settlement agreements and the mine had been permanently sealed. Danny had investigated enough industrial accidents to know they usually took months or years to resolve, especially ones involving multiple fatalities. Companies fought payouts. Insurance companies demanded extensive investigations. Families hired lawyers and filed lawsuits. But the Blackwater mine case had been wrapped up in less than a month. At the bottom of the file was a manila envelope marked Evidence, Property of Cumberland Coal Company. Inside were what looked like geological survey reports, pages covered with technical diagrams and mineral composition analyses that Danny couldn't fully understand. But one phrase kept appearing throughout the surveys. High-grade uranium ore deposits. Estimated value $2.3 million per ton. Danny sat back in his chair, the pieces clicking together in his mind. In 1962, uranium was incredibly valuable. The Cold War was at its peak. Nuclear weapons were being built as fast as possible, and uranium deposits were strategic resources. If the Blackwater mine had contained uranium worth millions of dollars per ton, that changed everything about the explosion. It wasn't just an industrial accident. It was potentially a cover-up to hide valuable mineral deposits. And right there, Danny made a decision. He was going to drive out to the old Blackwater mine site and see what remained of the place where his grandfather had supposedly died 50 years ago. The road to the Blackwater mine had been abandoned almost as long as the mine itself. Danny's patrol car bounced over potholes and cracked asphalt that nature was slowly reclaiming. The entrance gate hung open on rusted hinges, a faded sign still visible. Cumberland Coal Company. Authorized personnel only. Below it, someone had spray-painted danger, keep out in red letters that had bled down the metal like dried blood. Danny parked beside the gate and stepped out into the mountain silence. The air smelled of pine trees and old coal dust, with an underlying dampness that seemed to seep up from the earth itself. He walked up the gravel road, his boots crunching on stones mixed with coal fragments that still littered the ground. The deeper he went into the site, the more wrong everything felt. Danny had seen other abandoned mines during his time as sheriff, places that had been shut down due to declining coal prices or environmental regulations. But the Blackwater mine looked different. It looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Near what had once been the main office building, Danny found scattered papers half buried under decades of leaves. Most were too damaged to read, but he could make out fragments. Timesheets, safety reports, personnel records. The kind of paperwork that companies usually secured or destroyed when closing down operations. More concerning was what he found near the sealed mine entrance. Concrete blocks and steel reinforcement that looked far more extensive than necessary for a simple closure. This wasn't just sealing a dangerous mine shaft. This looked like someone had been determined to make sure nothing could ever get in or out. Danny walked around the perimeter of the seal, studying the construction. The concrete was poured thick, with steel beams welded across the opening in a crosshatch pattern. But what caught his attention were the dates stamped into the concrete at ground level. April 24th, 1962 and April 25th, 1962. The day after the reported explosion and the day after that. Danny frowned. According to the file he'd read, rescue operations had continued for several days after the explosion as teams tried to reach the trapped miners. But if they'd started sealing the mine entrance less than 24 hours after the incident, how could there have been any rescue attempts? He pulled out his phone and took photos of the concrete dates, the heavy steel reinforcement, the scattered paperwork. Then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A man was watching him from the tree line. The figure was maybe 60 yards away, partially hidden behind a cluster of pine trees. Tall, thin, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. When Danny raised his hand in a wave, the man stepped back deeper into the woods. "Hey," Danny called out. "You need something?" No response. The man melted back into the trees like he'd never been there. Danny's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon. In 15 years of law enforcement, he'd developed good instincts about when situations were about to turn dangerous. Something about the way the man had been watching, patient, careful, like someone with experience staying hidden, set off alarm bells. Danny walked quickly back to his patrol car, keeping his eyes on the tree line. As he got in and started the engine, His radio crackled. "Sheriff Morrison, you there? Go ahead. Got a call from someone asking about your location. Said he was from the state. Mining office. Wanted to know if you were investigating old mine sites today." Danny felt his chest tighten. "Did he give a name?" "Said his name was Henderson, but when I asked for a callback number, he said he'd call back later and hung up." Danny looked back toward the tree line where the man had been watching. No state mining inspector would be lurking in the woods at an abandoned mine site. And how had anyone known he was here? Back at the sheriff's office, Danny spread the Blackwater mine file across his desk and started making phone calls. His first call was to the West Virginia Department of Mining Safety. "I need to speak to someone about historical mine records," he told the receptionist. After several transfers, Danny found himself talking to a records clerk named Betty Mason, who had been with the department for 30 years. "Blackwater Mine," she repeated when Danny explained what he was looking for. "That name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. What year did you say?" 1962. Explosion that killed 17 miners." "Let me check our database," Danny heard typing in the background. "That's strange. I'm not finding any incident reports for a Blackwater mine in 1962. Are you sure about the name and date?" Danny stared at the file spread across his desk. "I'm holding the county sheriff's incident report right now. 17 miners killed in a methane explosion on April 23, 1962. Sir, I've been maintaining these records for 3 decades. We have documentation for every mine fatality in West Virginia, going back to the 1920s. If 17 miners died in 1962, there would definitely be a state investigation file. But there isn't one." Danny felt something cold crawl up his spine. The state had no record of the explosion. Cumberland Coal had officially closed the mine the day before it happened, and someone was still watching the site 50 years later. He picked up the phone again and dialed his father's number. "Dad, I need to ask you about Grandpa." His father was quiet for a moment. "What about him? How did he really die?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Danny, why are you asking about this now? Because I found a file that says he was killed in a mine explosion in 1962 along with 16 other men. But you always told me he died of a heart attack." His father's voice went very quiet. "Where did you find this file?" "In the county records." "Dad, what really happened to him?" "Son, there are some things that are better left buried. Your grandfather wouldn't want you digging into this. 17 men died dead. 17 families were lied to. If Grandpa was one of them, Danny, his father's voice was sharp now. Drop this. Trust me, some stones are better left unturned." The line went dead. Danny stared at the phone, his father's warning echoing in his head. But as he looked at his grandfather's name on the victim list, at the uranium surveys in the evidence envelope, at the photos he'd taken of the hastily sealed mine entrance, he knew he couldn't let it go. Now here's where things get even stranger. Danny spent the rest of the afternoon trying to track down the families of the other 16 miners listed in the incident report. Most of the surnames were familiar. Names he'd seen on mailboxes, heard at town council meetings. Families whose descendants still lived in and around Matewan. But when he started making calls, he hit the same wall over and over again. Henderson family? Oh, they moved away years ago, right after old Bill died, I think. The Caldwells. Haven't seen any of them since I was a kid. Heard they went up north somewhere. Bobby Garrett's family. They used to live on Elm Street, but the house has been empty for decades. By 5 o'clock, Danny had made 23 phone calls and found exactly 0 living relatives of the Blackwater mine victims. In a town where families went back generations, where people knew everyone's business going back 50 years, somehow all the families connected to the worst mining disaster in local history had simply vanished. That wasn't normal. That wasn't even possible. Later that night, Danny got a phone call that would change everything. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Sheriff Morrison, That's right. My name is Carl Hutchkins. I heard you've been asking questions about the old mine incident. Who told you that? Word travels fast in a small town, Sheriff. I was wondering if we could meet and talk. There are some things you should know before you dig too deep into this. What kind of things? The kind that got a lot of good people hurt back in 1962. The kind that could still get people hurt today. Danny felt his pulse quicken. Are you threatening me, Mr. Hutchkins? No, sir. I'm trying to warn you. There's a difference. They agreed to meet at an old diner on Route 119, about 10 miles north of town. Carl Hutchkins had to come alone and not tell anyone where he was going. Danny arrived 15 minutes early and did a careful sweep of the area, looking for signs of an ambush or backup vehicles. The place appeared deserted except for a single pickup truck parked near the diner's entrance. At exactly 8 o'clock, a man emerged from the shadows near the building. He was probably in his 70s, with white hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work. They sat down at a picnic table, and what Hutchkins told him was absolutely chilling. I was 22 years old then, Hutchkins began. Worked at the mine for about 3 years, usually on the day shift, but on April the 23rd, I called in sick. You were supposed to be working the day of the explosion. Should have been down there with the rest of them. James Morrison was my shift supervisor. Good man. Fair boss. If I hadn't had food poisoning that morning, I'd be dead too. So you believe the explosion really happened? Hutchkins laughed bitterly. Sheriff, there was no explosion. The words hung in the night air like a physical thing. Danny leaned. Forward. What do you mean? I mean those 17 men didn't die in any methane blast. They were murdered, shot down in the tunnels like dogs, and then buried behind concrete and steel so nobody could ever find the bodies. Danny's mouth went dry. How do you know this? Because I saw it happen. Hutchkins put down his coffee cup and looked Danny in the eye. I may have called in sick, but I couldn't sleep that morning. Felt guilty about leaving my crew short-handed, so around noon I drove out to the mine to see if they needed me for the afternoon shift. When I got there, I heard gunshots coming from underground. Not 1 or 2 shots, a lot of them, like a war was happening down in those tunnels. What did you do? Hid behind one of the equipment sheds and waited. About 20 minutes later, men started coming up from the mine. Not miners. Men in suits carrying rifles. Danny pulled out his notebook. How many men? 8 or 10, maybe more. They spent the next 2 hours bringing up equipment, files, boxes of stuff, loading it all into trucks that weren't marked with any company names. Did you recognize anyone? Hutchkins nodded grimly. Harold Vance, the Cumberland Coal Site supervisor, and Sheriff Hawkins. Both of them armed. Both of them giving orders like they were running the show. Danny felt ice in his veins. The sheriff was involved. Up to his neck, I watched him personally supervise the concrete trucks when they came to seal the mine entrance. Must have been 6 or 7 loads of concrete. Way more than you'd need just to close a shaft. Why didn't you report what you saw? Hutchkins laughed, but there was no humor in it. To who? The sheriff's department? Harold Vance owned half the county commissioners. And sheriff, you have to understand, this was 1962. The Cold War was hot. The government had all kinds of black projects running. People who asked too many questions had a way of disappearing. Danny studied the old man's face in the parking lot lights. But you're telling me now, because I'm 73 years old and I've been carrying this secret for 50 years. Because those 17 men had families who deserved to know the truth. Hutchkins reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal object, setting it on the picnic table between them. It was a brass shell casing, tarnished with age, but still clearly marked with caliber and manufacturer information. I picked this up outside the mine entrance that day, Hutchkins said. Figured someday someone might need proof that those men were shot, not killed in any explosion. Danny picked up the shell casing, turning it over in his hands. It was .306 caliber, military issue, The kind of ammunition used in government-issued rifles. There's something else, Hutchkins said. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. I managed to grab this from one of the boxes they were loading into the trucks. Geological survey report. Danny unfolded the paper and read by the light of his phone. The document was technical, full of mining terminology he didn't understand, but one section was circled in red ink. High-grade uranium ore. Concentration 2.7% by weight. Estimated reserves 47,000 tons. Current market value $127 million. Danny whistled low. $127 million in 1962, worth maybe 10 times that in today's money, Hutchkins said. And Sheriff, that was just the uranium. There were other minerals down there too. Rare earth elements that were even more valuable for weapons research. As if summoned by Hutchkins' words, headlights appeared on Route 119, moving slowly toward the diner. Both men watched as a dark sedan pulled into the parking lot and stopped about 50 yards away, its engine running, but the driver staying inside. "Time for me to go," Hutchkins said, standing up quickly. "Sheriff, be very careful who you trust. This conspiracy has roots in places you wouldn't expect." "Wait," Danny said. "How do I contact you if I need more information?" But Hutchkins was already walking toward his truck. "You don't. After tonight, Carl Hutchkins is going to disappear, just like those 17 families did. It's the only way to stay alive." The sedan's driver door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out. Danny's hand moved to his service weapon as the man walked slowly across the parking lot toward him. "Sheriff Morrison," the man called out. "I think we need to talk." The man in the suit was younger than Danny had expected, maybe 45, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that screamed federal agent. "Agent James Crawford, FBI," he said, pulling out a badge wallet. "Mind if we have a conversation?" "Depends on what kind of conversation you have in mind. The kind where I explain why poking around in 50-year-old mining accidents might not be in your best interest or the best interest of your community." What Crawford told him next was absolutely terrifying. The Blackwater mine incident in 1962 was part of a federal operation related to national security interests during the Cold War. Uranium extraction for weapons development. The miners who died weren't victims of an industrial accident. They were casualties of a necessary operation to secure strategic materials for the defense of the United States. Danny felt anger building in his chest. "You're telling me the federal government murdered 17 miners?" Crawford's expression didn't change. During the Cold War, difficult decisions had to be made to protect national security. The uranium deposits at Blackwater were critical to our nuclear weapons program. When the miners discovered the true nature of what they were extracting, they became a security risk. Crawford leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Your grandfather was a patriot, Sheriff. But he was also stubborn. When he threatened to go public with information about the uranium extraction, difficult decisions had to be made." Danny felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "You killed my grandfather because he wouldn't keep quiet about a government mining operation. Your grandfather died in service to his country, just like soldiers who die in classified missions overseas. The difference is, we couldn't give him a medal or a military funeral without compromising national security." Crawford stood up and closed his folder. "The same kinds of hard choices that are still being made today to protect national security. Is that why you're here? To make sure I make the right choice?" Crawford smiled again, and this time there was something predatory in his expression. "Sheriff, you're investigating the deaths of 17 men who supposedly died 50 years ago. If something were to happen to you during that investigation, an accident at an abandoned mine site, maybe a structural collapse in an old tunnel, it would be a tragic but understandable occupational hazard. Now that definitely sounds like a threat. It's a reality check. The people who ordered the Blackwater operation are still alive, still in positions of power, still making decisions about national security. They've spent 50 years protecting this secret, and they're not going to let a small-town sheriff expose it now. Crawford got in his car and rolled down the window. "You have 24 hours to decide, Sheriff. After that, the offer expires." What offer? The offer to walk away and live a long, quiet life. But Danny Morrison wasn't the kind of man who walked away from the truth. Not when 17 families deserved justice. Not when his grandfather had died trying to protect that truth. And definitely not when federal agents thought they could threaten him into silence. What happened next involved a desperate race to a safety deposit box that his grandfather had hidden 50 years earlier. A box that contained evidence so damaging that people were still willing to kill to keep it buried. Danny found the key with his Aunt Ruth, who'd been holding on to it for half a century, waiting for someone in the family brave enough to finish what James Morrison had started. The safety deposit box was at a bank in Logan County, under a false name. But when Danny got there, Crawford's people had beaten him to it. They tried to seize the box, tried to arrest him, tried to make sure the evidence never saw the light of day. But Danny had one advantage they didn't count on. He managed to get the contents of that box on camera, on live television, with news helicopters circling overhead, broadcasting everything to the world. Inside that box was his grandfather's letter, detailing everything that had happened. Execution orders signed by high-level government officials. Geological surveys proving the uranium and rare earth elements were worth billions. And most importantly, evidence that this wasn't just about Blackwater. There were dozens of other mining operations, hundreds of other victims, 80 years of systematic murder and cover-ups, all to steal natural resources that belonged to the American people. The conspiracy unraveled fast after that. Crawford and his team were arrested. Congressional hearings were launched. The remains of 16 miners were recovered from the sealed Blackwater mine, all showing evidence of execution-style gunshot wounds, exactly as Carl Hutchins had described. 6 months later, Danny stood at a memorial service honoring all 17 victims. Families who had been scattered and terrified for decades were finally able to come together, to mourn properly, to celebrate the courage of men who had refused to let their murders be covered up forever. But even as justice was being served, Danny knew the fight wasn't over. There were still other sites to investigate, still other families waiting for answers, still powerful people trying to claim immunity based on national security classifications. The Blackwater mine conspiracy had been exposed, but it was just the beginning of a much larger story about what happens when governments value resources more than human lives. So here's my question for you. If you discovered evidence of a massive conspiracy, would you risk everything to expose it, even if it meant putting your own life and your family's safety in danger? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to know where you stand on this, and if this story opened your eyes to how deep some conspiracies can go, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. There are more incredible true stories coming your way, stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.